Good afternoon. This is David Smith. I'm the president of the Forge Center for Peacebuilding and Humanitarian Education. And we are so glad that you're joining us this afternoon for this Forge Center conversation on post-crisis community building, post-crisis community well-being, applying lessons from peacebuilding and reconciliation to COVID-19 recovery efforts. So, and this in a way continues a conversation that we had last month. So our panelists will kind of blend in kind of from where we started from last month. I'm just going to just introduce our moderator, Chelsea Cornwell. And before I do that, I want to remind everyone that this is being recorded today. This is our 8th Forge Center conversation that we've had. We will continue to do these indefinitely. We've been running them about once a month. And if you go to our website, www.forgecenter.org, you can see the other ones that we have done. We do this as an effort in public education, of course, but also in an effort of raising the awareness of humanitarian education, emergency management, and peace building. So all of these events are kind of driven by our need and our want and our desire, we'll say, in order to share a conversation, create a conversation about really important topics. So Chelsea is our moderator again today. I'm always glad to see Chelsea. She holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Connecticut and a master's in disaster resilience from Tulane University. She is currently working as a JSOCCP certified clinician with juveniles in a residential treatment program to address inappropriate sexual behaviors through an accountability and strengths-based perspective. Her professional background includes work as a sexual assault victim advocate and AmeriCorps member working with educational programs for youth and interning as a NGO representative for the United Nations on behalf of the International Association of Schools of Social Work. Chelsea came to the Forge Center as a program participant in 2016, and we've never let her go after she came to us and joined the
program. Not that I've tried.
In 2017, she has served as controller evaluator and exercise director for the Forge Center's Education and Training Committee. So I'm going to turn it over to Chelsea, and then Chelsea will introduce Jess and Lauren, and we will go from there. I'll be hanging out, listening from the rafter, so to speak, but I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So Chelsea, I'll turn it over to you then.
Yes, welcome everybody. I have one tiny little correction for David because I started at a new job this week. Same organization, but I'm now the residential program director.
Congratulations.
So thank you. And it's quite the experience learning about how to navigate, crisis and community well-being in this leadership role as well. So I'm interested to take in what we have to talk about as well for my own personal and professional stuff going on. So I will let our speakers introduce themselves. Dr. Jess Bonham-White, I will turn this over to you to let people know about your background and what it is you're up to. She is instrumental at the Forge Center. So go ahead, Jess, what do you have?
I really shouldn't be going first, but then I can introduce my esteemed colleague. My name is Dr. Jess Bonham-White. I am the Director of Education and Training for the Forge Center. So I'm really happy to be here and happy to be seeing so many people still interact with us in this environment. We have a real passion for spreading some of these messages out into the professional community, as well as the student community and just the public to be thinking about all of the factors and some of the things that really do impact crisis management, a community trust building, well-being, all of these things. So we're really glad to have you. In my day job, I'm an associate professor of criminal justice at Stockton University in Galloway and Atlantic City, New Jersey, which is where I have met my esteemed colleague, Dr. Belasco. So I will give her the floor. We're going to have a presentation, then we're going to start a Q&A. So I'm really excited to hear about how these topics that we talk about today when it comes to post-crisis justice can impact and give us a greater thought or sort of open us up for creativity when it comes to things like responding to COVID-19. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Velasco.
Thank you so much, Jess, and thank you, Chelsea and David, for inviting me here today. I'm really happy to be here, and I think what I'm most looking forward to is that all of us have such diverse experiences in the type of work that we do, yet we have these common set of questions, right, about how we think about justice and security and community accountability. So I am an assistant professor of political science at Stockton University, and you know, a lot of the classes that I teach at Stockton center on the question of democracy, right? And particularly democracy outside of the US context. My research is similar in that I often study countries that are transitioning from authoritarian regimes or they're in a post-conflict phase, right? And undergoing peace processes. So what I'm going to try to bring here today may seem really outside of the field in which all of you are in, but I think that there might be some principles and some questions that can allow us to think creatively about some of the, you know, really tough things that we're struggling with in the United States right now. So I'm going to try to keep my remarks brief. I just want to give you some concepts and some ideas, again, coming from the transitional justice and the peace building backgrounds, and then I'd love to open it up for discussion. So I will share my screen here. You know, Zoom always like the little menu at the top when you want to hit slideshow. There we go, from the beginning. So I want to just start with two quotes that just to sort of paint a picture of what we're thinking about living with COVID, right? And sort of moving towards a new phase. And I have the articles, and of course, I'll be happy to share the reading list and the slides with anyone who's interested. But just to get us started, the first is from George Packer. When the virus came here, it found a country with serious underlying conditions, and it exploited them ruthlessly. Chronic ills, a corrupt political class, a sclerotic bureaucracy, a heartless economy, and a divided and distracted public had gone untreated for years. We had learned to live uncomfortably with the symptoms. It took the scale and the intimacy of a pandemic to expose their severity, to shock Americans with the recognition that we are in the high-risk category. And the second is from Dr. Jennifer Roberts. Fast forwarding to a century later, the COVID-19 pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, and the protest demonstrations attended by millions, as well as the insurrection of 2021, all mirror a place that we have seen before in this country. It seems that syndemics, or rather the aggregation of multiple epidemics, the coronavirus, police brutality, followed by racial violence, are the strands that make up America's DNA. And it's just, these are two key ideas to just keep in mind once we sort of return full circle in thinking about some of the concepts I'm about to engage in. So just to give you a brief outline, there are two books that I'll be referring to in regards to thinking about peace building, and that's Lederach's Moral Imagination, and a new book that just came out from Dr. Joanna Quinn, Thin Sympathy. And then I'll talk a little bit about transitional and transformative justice in my work, and then we can move out for discussions. Now, John Paul Lederach's The Moral Imagination asks the central question: how do we transcend the cycles of violence that bewitch our human community while living in them? Transcending violence for him then is forged by the capacity to generate, mobilize, and build that moral imagination. And what Lederach is getting at with that moral imagination is what is required of us as a community after experiencing a crisis, right? Albeit a conflict, right? Some sort of trauma, and how we think about moving forward. And again, these are just sort of principles for us to keep in mind as we think about moving forward in our own local communities and the work we do. And the first discipline is the idea that we are interdependent, right? We are all connected, and that includes moving forward, right? These are not things that we can do on our own when we talk about these concepts of reconciliation and community and security. The second is the practice of paradoxical curiosity. And what Lederach is referring to here is that we need to move beyond either or categories: victim, perpetrator, enemy, hero. Instead, we all have the capacity to engage in harm, right? But that means we all have the capacity to be accountable, and we all have the capacity to become better. Then there's the space for creative art. Now, that idea of creativity, again, is, I remember at the start of the pandemic, right? We started talking about all of these structural inequalities that the United States has always faced, and now it was on steroids with the pandemic, the legacies of racial injustice and violence, right, towards Black Americans and communities of color here in the United States. And we thought, okay, maybe this is a turning point. Maybe this is a moment for us to think about a new world, right? So that requires creativity. And the last is the willingness to take risk. All of the initiatives that we might talk about here today, or potential ideas, it requires us to be uncomfortable and to take a step forward, knowing that maybe some of these things may not work, right? But the idea is that we step forward. I also want to reference Dr. Quinn's book, Thin Sympathy, because this is also something really new in the field of transitional justice, which is Dr. Quinn makes this argument that we actually, before we can even think about transitional justice, which I'll get into in a second, truth commissions, reparations, reconciliation processes, a society first needs to have thin sympathy. And that's the basic understanding or knowledge of what has happened in the past. And it involves sensitizing a population to recognize the facts of history and how what happened to them, sorry, that's a typo there, to them continues to shape the lived experiences of the people to whom those things happened. In other words, we need to all have some sort of common understanding of what has happened, right? And at least be in a space where we can acknowledge each other's lived experiences before we even really think about bigger projects of moving forward. Now, the field of transitional justice is massive, right? It's an industry unto itself in terms of thinking about the policymakers involved, the think tanks, the NGOs, how governments have engaged in it. But transitional justice emerged really in the 1980s, starting really in Latin America, and it was after the fall of authoritarian regimes. As countries transitioned to democracy, there was a serious question of how, right, questions of the past were addressed. So, particularly under military dictatorships like in Argentina and Chile, where thousands of people were disappeared, detained, tortured, assassinated. How do we actually hold the state accountable for those human rights abuses? And the aims of transitional justice vary quite a bit, right? And as I'll show you in a second, some countries, particularly in Latin America, went after a much more legal process of holding special prosecutions as well as truth commissions. Other countries have engaged in reparations, right? Whether it be financial payouts or community building and investment projects or memorials. And others have taken on much more local, culturally driven processes, like the Gacaca courts in Rwanda after the genocide there. So context is important, right? But the idea of transitional justice is typically the state is involved, and typically it's about looking at a specific period of the past, although that has come under some scrutiny or criticism, as I'll get into. So when we think about that idea of transitional justice, then there's the backward-looking goals of recognition and repair and non-recurrence, and also the forward-looking goals of how do we have a democracy, right? What does rule of law and human rights look like? And just as a very brief overview here again, when we think about the specific initiatives we often associate with transitional justice, we can think about special prosecutions, truth commissions, reparations, lustration policies, and institutional reforms. And I'll be happy in the Q&A to give a little bit more of specific examples if anyone is interested. And in fact, the United States, at least at a state level, right, we have actually had several truth commissions come about, and some that are underway. And there have been current calls for a much more, at a national level, a truth commission that looks at the legacy of racial discrimination and violence in this country. There's also another idea that it's sort of interesting in my work. I've sort of emerged in the transitional justice field, hearing about transformative justice, and then sort of falling into the type of work that's actually already been happening in the United States quite a bit. So at least let me just start with the transitional justice field. As I said, many of the mechanisms I just talked about were often top-down processes, right? It was political elites bargaining, coming up with these initiatives, about what a truth commission might look like, who would be able to be prosecuted, right? Who might receive amnesty. It didn't really involve victim survivors per se, or at least center their experience. And in fact, and some of you might know this in the legal field, right? Sometimes a legal process where a survivor has to go and tell their story about how, their experiences, whether it's sexual violence or some other act of violence, that can also be very re-traumatizing. And so there were all these questions about, are these initiatives actually centering the people who should stand to benefit the most from them? And so this idea of transformative justice has sort of started working its way into the conversation. And I use this quote from Wendy Lamborn here, who was really one of the first to start thinking about it in this post-authoritarian, post-conflict scenario. And what she says is, look, not only do we need to be much more culturally sensitive about how we think about justice and truth telling and accountability, right? We also need to be much more holistic, that we have to account for the social, psychological, right? And the political elements that also feed into how people recover from trauma and what they need to move forward. So this again starts to move things away from a top-down state-led process to something that is much deeper. And maybe instead of just looking at, say, a 10-year period where there was an authoritarian regime or a really dark period in a country's history, maybe we need to look at the broader history, right, that may have informed that moment that a truth commission might focus on. And again, we can get a little bit more specific in the Q&A. Matthew Evans has also played around with this a little bit, right? Where, again, when we think about transitional justice as truth commissions, amnesties, trials, he argues there should be a much more economic component, right? That the emphasis on just restoring civil and political rights, for example, after a country has just recovered from dictatorship, you also have to look at sort of the economic needs that people require in order to live dignified lives, right? And so again, thinking about maybe what should transitional justice prioritize? Now, it's very important to note that, I've given those very limited examples of typically of regime change, but now transitional justice has been used in a lot of different contexts, right? In fact, sometimes these conversations happen like in Syria, where the conflict still has not ended yet. There's much more of a focus on post-conflict transitional justice now, more than say the subject of regime change. And I think what's even more interesting and perhaps crucial to our conversation is that consolidated democracies like the United States and Canada are receiving more and more attention, or even European countries with their history of colonialism. In the field, it's often been, especially from the US perspective, of this is what other countries do when they are struggling with these massive structural and societal trauma and transformation. But in the United States, we have that. We have some serious crises going on here. And so thinking about how transitional justice might be able to facilitate some of that healing, or at least accountability, is a question that a lot of us have been wrestling with. So transformative justice, just to pivot a little bit, there's been some great books that have recently come out. And this has been some of the really local work that's been happening in the United States about how communities can address harm without relying on the state. And a lot of this work has emerged from Black activists, queer communities, disability activists, right? Communities that have typically been marginalized or have not felt like they can rely on state or formal agencies for help. And so they've had to come up with their own form of resilience. And I'm sure you've all heard some of this discourse, recently, thinking about, okay, how does restorative and justice and transformative justice practices, how can they make their way so that we can avoid relying on the criminal justice system, right? And instead think about other ways of repairing harm and holding people accountable. Similarly, so Jairus Dixon was the previous from the previous slide, and Mia Mingus, just another one, right? This is transformative justice at its most basic level, is the idea of responding to violence without creating more violence and engaging in harm reduction to lessen that violence. And I think the other major point I want to emphasize with transformative justice is that often when we think about accountability and harm, we've often thought about it in a very retributive justice framework, right? An individualized thing, right? I was hurt, right? This happened to me and this was my perpetrator, just even using that kind of language. And transformative justice asks us to step out from that and actually look at maybe some of the root causes, right? The structural, the societal causes that might have led to those harms in the first place. And also thinking about as a community, how we may have been complicit in aiding some of those harms, and how we all then should think about our own process of accountability, right? To make sure that these harms are not continued. So I know I went sort of quickly, but I'm much more interested in our conversation. I'll be happy to go back to any of these slides. There's just a couple more points I want to get at before we move to the questions. The first is, I think we need to move beyond our conventional understandings of time. And the transitional justice field has also sort of been interrogating this. Saying post-conflict or even post-COVID or post-pandemic, could that actually do more harm than good, right? Because maybe what we might consider, okay, I'm in a post-pandemic type of life right now. Maybe for other people, that's not quite true. And do we end up making invisible some people's lived experiences if we start using that language of pre and post, right? And maybe we need to be a little bit more creative, right? Or conceptual about how we talk about what it means in this new chapter that we're moving towards. The second is, how do we hold an understanding of each other that moves beyond dualities, right? And this is going back to Letter Rock. Let's move beyond that idea that a person can only be a victim or only be a perpetrator, and instead think about we understand that we are complex. We understand that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, and everybody deserves, some sort of process of accountability for harms that they may have inflicted on others. And that leads to the other point that I hope sort of drives our conversation today. Accountability, reconciliation, justice, security. We often assign our own understandings and expectations of these concepts, right? And that needs to be part of the conversation, because there might be some contest there, right? There might be some important ideas that we actually need to flesh out. We shouldn't just go in thinking that there's a universal understanding of how we conceive of these really important ideas, right? And that leads to my last point here, which are some of the questions. Oh, okay, yeah, that came out okay. The first one was actually prompted by Jess and really the start of this conversation. So I just wanted to reiterate it because I thought it was so well phrased in promoting this webinar. That, okay, we've thought about this stuff in cases of mass violence or warfare, but what does all of this look like following a pandemic, right? When we still are dealing with these very real issues of threat and vulnerability and isolation and the loss of community solidarity, can any of these tools that I've talked about be useful? And that's where I also offer a couple of additional questions, right? That maybe today you can reflect a little bit, like what have we actually struggled with, our democracy and within our communities that existed before the pandemic that now seem exacerbated and we really need to focus on repairing or addressing? What issues do you think these ideas of justice, truth, and reconciliation, like what issues do you think need to be addressed? What goals would you like to see to achieve through reconciliation and truth telling? And I will say those two, even though, for example, in South Africa, it was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Often those concepts can come into tension with each other, right? Because people have sometimes their idea of what truth is, right? And we're getting to that common understanding can actually be a process that involves some conflict and negotiation and struggle. So we might want to think about those things as two separate processes. Maybe we all need some sort of shared understanding before we can even get to that reconciliation part. And then finally, there's always limitations with these processes, and I think it's worth carving those out as well. So I'm going to stop sharing here. And I'd be happy to repost those questions in the chat if that's something that could be useful. But I thank you. And I guess I can open this up. Maybe Jess, if you have any follow-up thoughts and any questions we might have from the group.
Sure. Thank you so much. You know, we thought it would be important for everyone to sort of have a common understanding of transitional and transformative justice in the classic sphere, because we're trying to push it a little bit more and thinking about it in terms of pandemic and thinking about it in terms of humanitarian response, emergency management response here in the US, right? That is a humanitarian function here. Post-disaster response, all of these things, and sort of even how we think about this in terms of our planning. And any of you in the emergency management world, in the humanitarian world, we already know that these events, hurricanes, tornadoes, other things, tend to be exacerbated by current conditions economically, socially, politically, all of these things, right? We have textbooks and textbooks that sort of say that. Those of us who teach it, we show it to our students over and over again. They're surprised. Why did this happen? Well, here it is. Here's the research. Sometimes, however, sort of maybe it goes less said that these crisis events also are exacerbators themselves, meaning that they themselves create a new sense of justice and victimhood. You know, when it comes to hurricanes and tornadoes, it's awfully hard to stand there and sort of shake your fist at them and say, you know, stop, or you've done this to me, because wind doesn't care, right? Like floods don't care, snow doesn't care. When it comes to pandemic as an emergency event that brings about, uses the same processes of response that oftentimes we see in other emergency events, in other disaster events, you know, the same logistics processes, preparedness, all of these things, but it's human. The issue may be a virus, but the spreading of it, the response to it, the sort of precautions people need to take, it's a public health event. And of course, many of you also in the emergency management world know that for decades, we've been sitting on it's going to be a pandemic. That pandemic is going to be the thing that really is going to open this up and really show potentially where some of our weaknesses were in terms of emergency response. And of course, that has been shown, right? We also know that pandemics involve some of the same state actors in the response to pandemics, the same state actors that response to hurricane or tornadoes might be. But once again, the threat, while it is biologic in nature, also comes from fellow people not following procedures, potentially non-enforcement of certain things. And that was a big thing. How do we actually enforce this? That's really important. And again, in the United States, and I love how you talked about sort of that localized idea, you must take into account, right, the sort of localized culture of what things like responsibility and accountability mean. What does it mean? I do research in policing. In some other countries, the police have very much been a part of enforcing mask mandates and enforcing these things. Whereas in the United States, with our 18,000 different agencies, like what would that look like and sort of how would that act? That brought up a lot of questions too. And something that I want to sort of throw at this before we open it up, because I love your questions afterwards, is that we have to remember that the root of the word victim is sacrifice. And so very often when we're talking about people who have or feel that they've been victimized, in some way they feel or they've had the experience of having been a sacrifice for something else, or, you know, for somebody else, right? That sort of whatever they needed, they wanted, whatever their issue was, that became more important than their own human dignity, their preservation of life, all of these things. And one of the things that we're noting here, while everyone wants to jump back, right back into life, be, as you said, post-COVID, what I think a lot of us are struggling with in terms of public policy and things like that is, how do we deal with the really important emotional and community outcomes where for 15 months, the threat came from within, right? That it was your neighbors who did or did not mask, or did not, you know, had their barbecues, didn't go and do this. And of course, all of this is wrapped up in ideas about individual rights and all of this. And again, who is going to enforce and sort of all these things. And so some of these narratives very much reflect that idea of sacrifice, potentially as well, if there were fatalities within a family or you know, within a circle that, you know, people feel like could have been prevented. And then, as you said, and I'll end with this and sort of go on here, none of this can be divorced from the other things that were going on in 2020 and now obviously in 2021, that understanding COVID can only be understood in the context of the other crises. I loved this term, syndemic. I've never heard that. I'm now going to use it in my classes, that really these multiple things happening, we're exposing and re-exposing some of the weaknesses in our own response systems, some of the attitudes that we have towards those response systems. And I think for all of us thinking about not only how do we continue the response to COVID and sort of get our communities on board with things like vaccinations and sort of all of this, how do we think about planning for such, you know, this is a new aspect of planning that while many of us kind of hoped we wouldn't have to plan, we do, right? So that's where I'm, you know, I'll stop with my comments. I know Chelsea may have something to say, and then I'd love if our attendees who come from a variety of backgrounds that we've at least seen from your emails, potentially can sort of open up more questions and thoughts and discussions about where we start with this. And this may be multiple discussions. Chelsea.
Yeah, so one of the things that we have known in emergency management and in disaster recovery is that disasters, they press on the weak points and the divisions in our societies, and they expose them really severely. And in things like, you know, hurricanes and earthquakes, that becomes very visually clear. Like the Black communities are the ones that are completely flooded and their homes are completely destroyed rather than just damaged. Earthquakes, poor families are the ones without the specialized structures that you know, can withstand the shaking, and so their homes are more damaged. And it's what's been very interesting about the pandemic is that also is very clear to those of us who are attentive to those you know, community divisions already. But there's now this, you know, element of truth, and so what is truth and whose truth is, you know, correct, because there is not the same type of immediately visual evidence to those who need it in front of them to say, oh, yep, that's a socioeconomic problem. And so what do we do with these conflicting ideas about the basis of truth? You know, we mentioned truth commissions as a method for recovery or reconciliation, or, you know, just moving forward. How do we hold a truth commission, you know, with a divided government, whose very ideas about truth, just with even the insurrection in January, the truth about what that event was and what happened, you know, that's kind of where my mind is stuck, is how do we move forward if we don't agree on the very basis of the premise of what we need to build on to move forward. And so I don't know if either one of you can speak to that question.
It's so important, Chelsea. You're absolutely right. And I've been reflecting on that myself in preparation for today, hoping that I'd have some sort of beautiful answer for you. And I don't, because the political scientist in me is like, yeah, you're right. Like, if we don't at that level, right, if there's not even an agreement that there should be an investigation, that this is recognized as something that is wrong, that we need to kind of excavate and reflect on so that it doesn't happen again, it doesn't. The only thing, I think, at least when we look at it from the United States, I think where a lot of promise lies is at the local level, as you mentioned, right? And even if organizations and local communities might come together and say, okay, let us focus on this very specific issue that maybe we struggled with in the pandemic, and do that type of excavation to see what did we do right? What did we do wrong, right? What communities did we maybe leave out, or we need to better engage with, right? So I think that even at the federal level, when there is that type of resistance or just incapacity, right, or lack of political will, there's still a lot of space at the local level for people to engage in this type of, really engaging in their citizenship, right? Thinking, okay, well, what kind of democracy would we like to see, right? How do we want to make our communities resilient or reconcile some of the trauma that we've experienced? And so sometimes going back to that local level, again, allows for that creative space that at a national level just may not be present at the moment. Jess, I don't know if you have any thoughts.
I struggle with this, and in many ways, the sort of idea that when we think about truth and the goalposts of truth, they always have, right? Like, they change as we learn more and more about people's lived experiences. My own perception of my lived experience changes. Now, I think it depends if you believe that your lived experience is the only lived experience, and therefore others become threats to yours, which I think is a social thing that sort of we need to think about in our country. In the American context, there are different cultural contexts, because in some ways, sort of that narrative is one that we don't acknowledge very often, right? And I'll say this because it's something, and I see that there's a question in the Q&A box also about conflict resolution. And just like with transitional justice, there's conflict resolution and there's conflict transformation, right? This sort of idea that there's a lot of things that have moved from sort of, right then wrong, this then that, problem then resolved, is that we have to transform the way we talk about it, and potentially in transforming it, we transform that whole thing. And I always love to use the definition of conflict by the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is located in DC, that a conflict is a natural, a given part of human interaction wherein two or more parties believe or sort of think, or I add perceive their interests to be sort of not aligned or to be in direct competition, right? And oftentimes we think that's the way it is, that sort of my need to be safe during COVID was directly in opposition to your need to do whatever you needed to do in COVID as well, right? Like that idea is something that I think we struggle with, and then we as Americans tend to go about it by using the word compromise. And if you know anything about me, I love definitions of words, and compromise, if you literally look at sort of the root of it, it's co-promise. And too often we use compromise as a code word for I need you to really, 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 really listen to what I say and change you. And then we've compromised, right? And power comes into play. And this is always important when it comes to things like emergency management, it comes to humanitarian aid, all of these things. You cannot divorce what we're doing from power situations, right? From the power relationships that we are in. And no matter what, power is very important. And very often, those who we are asking to co-promise something are not empowered. It generally is those in power asking those who are disempowered or marginalized to change what they need so we can continue with the power structure. And even when we think about, transitional justice, where it's the state down, the idea behind that is the maintenance of the state in some way, that the state needs to maintain sort of itself in some sort of way, so there's not complete breakdown. So we need everyone below the state level to kind of get a new idea of the state so that they are invested in in keeping it going forward. And so when we're talking about this stuff in the classroom, and when we're talking about sort of truth and things like that, there is going to be pushback. There always will be, because it's part of the challenge, right? That's part of the sort of the crisis in imagination, the sort of, wait, the world I thought I was in is not that world. And sometimes we do need to bring people through it. How to work with such sort of right now, the current need to not talk about it at all, to the point that I hate saying it, but that's going to exacerbate the problem even more, right? That sort of, by saying you cannot, for example, teach about structural racism is in and of itself, and this is not me, I've seen this, many people, is in and of itself indicative of structural racism, right? Like that's what it is. And so when goalposts are changing, I think sometimes you really do kind of have to sit down and say, why are the goalposts changing? Why are we having this pushback? But we also need to have leadership who plans, and I keep on going back to planning, who planned for the pushback so that it can happen, and response to it can be one that where we transform the dialogue, as opposed to saying, you're right, that's a problem, shut down, right? I don't know how, that's kind of what this is. How do we incorporate that knowledge into planning, into response, into preparedness, so that we know it when it comes around the corner and we can grab it?
And I think that really touches on, one of the questions in our Q&A boxes from Tiara, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, is, it's related to the idea of the duality that you were speaking about, friend versus enemy. So how do we move ourselves away from that, black and white polarization when addressing structural trauma, and also, people who are also not willing to engage in moving away from those distinctions. So that's another layer of challenge, is that there are going to be folks who agree that there is, space for both victim and perpetrator, or space for both friend and enemy within each one of us and in each one of our communities. So how do we move forward with that while also trying to engage folks who don't recognize or are unwilling to engage in that idea? Big question.
Yeah, it is. And it's a super important one. I think for my frame of reference, I think about the classroom, right? Because things are pretty politicized right now. I teach political science classes. We have to deal with, we're dealing with these topics in real time. And there's a charged energy. And I think as a teacher, I try to approach it as, setting some ground rules that we all deserve to be treated with dignity, right? Like thinking about when people get defensive, right? Is there a fear that's happening? You know, and how do we sort of dismantle that fear, at least, to get to a point where even if we're engaging in this critical thinking and fleshing out these ideas, and there is this conflict that's existing, students don't feel as if they are feeling dehumanized, that they are feeling that they are not valued, right? And that we're really trying to engage in a process of unpacking the idea, right? The challenges, the whether it's a political issue, whether it's, I mean, the reality is oftentimes, you know, students are maybe bringing in misinformation, right? So how do we challenge misinformation or quote unquote fake news? But again, not necessarily going after the student's integrity or their place there, but rather helping them think more deeply about these ideas, right? And it's not easy. It's, you know, but I think I often wonder sometimes that insecurity and fear come hand in hand, and that can result in defensiveness and you know, escalate things. And so for me, it's okay, how do we de-escalate these things first, right? So that students at least know that they're all here, you know, ready to accept each other and to challenge these things, but not necessarily challenge each other's humanity. And so that I'll just throw that out there.
And if I could pop in there to remark on two things that you just said. First of all, sort of when we're thinking about classrooms, we can think about this outside the classroom too. You know, and you said, you know, I'm an instructor, I'm a professor of political science, and sort of there's this idea that like, well, that belongs in the political science classroom, right? And it's sometimes, and I hear this a lot in public policy, public management, things like this. Emergency management, sort of this need to like, but we can't address those, or we shouldn't, because somehow that may indicate that we are no longer non-impartial or non-neutral and sort of things like that. When in fact, not doing so in and of itself can be a partiality that like, whoop, and you know, really thinking back to the mission, that if the mission of what you're doing needs you to address this because the safety, the protection of life and property is such that you need to understand all the things that sort of put those even in greater harm's way. If you're not talking about those, then you yourself are creating risk of damage or loss of life and property and safety and community and sort of all of these things too, right? So there's this idea that sort of these discussions belong in some places and not others, and that's just not true. And which is great. Like I'm sort of I'm glad you brought that up there. That sort of there's this tension in the political science classroom, as you know, and now outside of that, there's even, you know, like that's true too. That sort of we sort of have this idea that there are places to talk about it, not talk about it, when in fact what we're talking about is our human interaction, a community. We always need to be talking about this. And then you know, when you talk about insecurity, I want to bring into this too that security in and of itself is the absence of pure risk, right? This sort of like if we think about the risk equation that many of us work with on a regular basis in risk analysis. Risk is the probability of an event times its consequences, right? And so pure risk is when bad things will happen all the time. Like there's a 100% probability that a bad outcome will come as opposed to a good outcome, right? And so insecurity is where people perceive that may or may not be reality, right? But if they perceive that if I interact with something or if I do this, bad things will happen all the time, right? And so again, in thinking about sort of response to crisis events, thinking about COVID, right? Where did people like, was it that there was just sort of this idea that sort of bad things were just going to happen all the time? That, you know, like, was it the probability, the likelihood of something, the outcome of something? Where, you know, how are people's narratives of insecurity? How are we learning from their narratives of insecurity so that we're not asking them, again, to compromise on their feeling of being sacrificed, being victimized by something? Because again, we talk about re-victimization and traumatization, sort of all of this. How do we learn from the logic that people created about insecurity that we can then think about pushing against or changing? Can we change either the probability idea or the consequence idea, just sort of in anything? I mean, my research is with public agencies. So if you think every time you interact with a public agency, something bad is going to happen, you're going to avoid that public agency, right? So really, it's that bringing back to what you brought in with Letterrock in terms of taking risk, right? We also need to remember that as people take risk, they are pushing their boundaries of insecurity as well. And that we in the educational field who potentially interact with those who really are, you know, sort of the world is one way, and it's sort of, why not? We're putting them in a vulnerable situation, and having that be a place of like, it's safe to be vulnerable right now, to begin to rethink our own risk assessments, I think is really important, but it's incredibly difficult, right? It is incredibly difficult, particularly if the narrative, as Tiara has there, is right and wrong, friend and enemy, sort of this and that. If you have to start potentially breaking that down, you brought up the sort of the hero, non-hero, right? If we need to be questioning those things, that in and of itself brings in insecurity. I think about, you know, I'm utterly fascinated by, and I hope anthropologists do sort of the ethnography of mask wearing. Like, how did that become? We know it was so politically polarized, but then what narratives did people begin to build, and do they still have about, for example, mask wearing now, right? What does it mean if you're wearing a mask now but you're vaccinated? What signal are you, like everyone's worried about the signals they're sending and sort of things like that, right? How do we plan for those sorts of things? Big questions. More, I don't know if anyone else, more participants, a Q&A. Chelsea, more thoughts?
Well, there was a comment that was placed in the chat box about how most African nations never are able to get vaccination or get vaccination, and therefore and I'm going to read the question directly. Even though the US gets control of the crisis, if part of the world never gets the vaccination, are we safe at this time? And Jess, you had responded with a really interesting comment about, what does this mean? Because we're not all in the same space.
No.
And so then when we bring it like real to the highest macro we can, when we look at the idea of global justice and global moving forward, and again, it's a global pandemic deepening and pressing on the divisions in the global society. And what forum exists other than the UN to address those issues? But then again, you look at the UN and it is managed by the countries who have the power. And so,
and maybe that brings us into the third question, or sort of the thing that Dr. Ablasco opposed with, sort of what, in your viewpoint, what can we take from transitional and transformative justice and apply? What maybe is not so much, in thinking as well that there are going to be these global ideas of sort of who got the vaccine, who didn't, when, where, how many more people had to die while we were deciding, whose profit would get, for a vaccine. All of those things are, from a global level to a local level. What are some things that you think that you've sort of been able to reflect on as to sort of can be applied, and maybe how would we do that or start thinking about it?
Well, I think, one of the ideas that I've been reflecting on this week for today is when we think about accountability of our state leaders, right? This is where I think, whether it's transitional justice language per se, right? But I think, again, bringing back that idea of accountability and how things were done, right? How decisions were made, what missteps were taken. As a democratic society, I think we have a responsibility to sort of press for that sort of reflection of what we need to do to better prepare for next time. In terms of the global inequality of vaccines, I mean, it is quite surreal, just as an observation where we have, and I'm not necessarily judging this, but here we have raffles and lotteries for vaccinations. And we have other countries or, people are dying every day, waiting to have access to it. And I'm always a little afraid that our own experience here, I mean, this gets to the question that was raised, and to your point, Jess, that we experience this sort of, it's just that it's very surreal in that, like, how your lived experience here is really not informing how much struggle and difficulty is happening outside of the United States. And that might inform how, again, thinking about it from a political standpoint, how do we hold our leaders accountable when we think about ideas like vaccine diplomacy? And if we do have excess vaccines, should we press, for example, President Biden to make sure that they are distributed to countries that are more in need, right? Like, maybe we need to make that a political priority then. But I also think about how memorials might play a role too, right? Again, thinking about it from that transitional justice lens, where we make sure that we don't have this sort of amnesia of what happened, but that we do think about how can we reflect and remember it in a thoughtful way, right? That is maybe driven by the families who experience the most hardship through this pandemic, to make sure that memory kind of serves a larger purpose, right? About how frail we all are as humans, right? And how we have a responsibility to each other. Just some thoughts.
Well, I guess, that seems like a natural ending point, and we're just about at 5 o'clock. So I feel like we're all leaving this with a lot of questions and things that have been elevated. And unfortunately, these are such intricate questions and difficulties that it's really difficult to find an answer for, especially one that would be applicable to, local communities, state level communities, national communities, and then of course, global communities. So I guess what can we take away from this to feel like we have something we can bring back out into the world? Is there a commitment, or is there a personal ideal that we can make a commitment to kind of move forward with? I always like having something finite that I can leave with, rather than all of these unanswerable questions, which is unfortunately what's plaguing our society a lot right now. And so any insight from either of you?
I think the one thing that, if anyone could to take something away, is to just for us to be a little bit sensitive when we hear that language of post-COVID, post-pandemic living, right? For a lot of us, we are entering into maybe a different stage in our lives where things are opening up. But I think that, again, if we're trying to build empathy and compassion in our communities, it's beholden on us to be a little bit more introspective about the fact that there are still a lot of families that are struggling with grief, that are struggling economically because of how hard the pandemic may have hit them and their families. And so that we don't just move past and say, well, that was last year, that's in the past and we're now. And instead, we really do think about how trauma might continue with our neighbors and with our communities, and so that we approach that with a sensitivity and care, because I think that's the first step towards us thinking about, okay, these bigger projects of what, a truth commission or so a memorial might look like.
That's a really interesting point, and it kind of touches on the part one aspect of this, community trauma. What is community trauma? And really what it boils down to is it's a collection of people who've experienced trauma, individuals as trauma. And so it always comes back to the individual. And so we can look at that in our local communities and our global communities. How can we support people who have had trauma? And even it's as simple as changing our language and being attuned to how we discuss these issues amongst each other. I think that's a really, especially with the narrative of, oh, it'll go back to the way it used to be. there are people whose families have been decimated by this, whose lives will never be the same as what it used to be. And so
and maybe that what used to be, you know, once again, may not have been, you know, this exacerbated some conditions that people were living with and living through, that to go back to that would be to go back to the inequity, the, you know, the structural challenges, all of those things too, that, you know, I mean, I think the thing that I would walk away with is that for as much pushback, and some of you may need to hear this, it may be hard, it's hard to kind of hear it without sort of the sort of support that goes with it, but this is the stuff that needs to be spoken about, right? So you are doing the good work when you are, you know, when you sit down and you're doing after action reports or things like that, right? How do you know, and you're thinking about your community. It's hard for me to think about the national level because, man, but at the community level, really sitting down, how did economics impact our capacity to be able to respond? How did sort of different experiences of marginalization historically in our community, how did that? It's going to be hard. It's going to be something that you will get pushback on, but it is the thing to do because it meets your mission. If your mission as a public safety organization, as an emergency management organization, is to think about all of the factors that impede preparedness, response, recovery, mitigation. If you don't talk about it, then you're not doing the mission. When you do, you are.
And I'll just echo that that's really supported in the literature around any crisis management, disaster response. You know, my master's degree was disaster resiliency leadership, and it was built on the pillars of this, looking at economic, look at the social aspects, environmental aspects, and that is key with any kind of division and disaster related issues. So I'm sure that we could be drawn into a whole nother webinar tangent, really long conversation. But I want to thank everybody for attending. And thank you to both of you for your incredible words and perspectives. So David had placed in our chat box a contact for if you're interested in looking at other webinars that we have. I'm sure that anyone is in attendance has been added to our email listserv. We have a website, foragecenter.org, where you can find everything that we're up to.
All of the previous webinars are on our YouTube channel. So there's a YouTube channel. So you can go back and watch part 1 on community trauma.
Yeah. And that's where we'll post for other upcoming webinars as well. He also mentioned that we are beginning face-to-face activities later this year. And so we've had some projects brewing. One of the things we do is do simulations of how to respond to complex disasters and emergencies. And all of that information is on our website. So please feel free to reach out to the email address provided if you need any more information or interested in our contact information. And thank you all so much for being here today.